Welcome everyone to the final installment of the Fall Environmental Resilience Speaker Series, jointly presented by Indiana University's Integrated Program in the Environment and the Environmental Resilience Institute. I'm Sarah Mincy, Director of IPE and Managing Director for ERI, and I'm so pleased that you're able to join us today. Both IPE and ERI are founded on the understanding that interdisciplinary learning and research are essential to teach today's scholars and solve today's problems, not to mention tomorrow's. So we're pleased to facilitate conversations with some of today's leading environmental resilience experts from across the disciplines to address topics from climate change to socio-environmental challenges that are affecting our health, our communities, and our economy. We wish to pause now and acknowledge the honor the Indigenous communities native to this region and recognize that Indiana University Bloomington is built on Indigenous homelands and resources. We recognize the Miami, Delaware, Potawatomi, and Shawnee people as past, present, and future caretakers of this land. IPE was founded in 2012 by the provost and the leadership of the O'Neill School, the College of Arts and Sciences, and the School of Public Health to bring together all of the environmental and sustainability scholarship across the various schools and departments on the Bloomington campus. And ERI was founded in 2017 as a part of the Prepared for Environmental Change Grand Challenge. Its mission is to enhance resilience to environmental change in Indiana and beyond by accurately predicting impacts and effectively partnering with communities to implement feasible, equitable, and research-informed solutions. IPE and ERI faculty, staff, and students have worked together to bring you a robust set of speakers this semester every Friday at noon, and we will be continuing the speaker series in the spring semester. You can find information about each of the talks for the spring semester upcoming on the ERI and IPE web pages and in regular newsletters and other outreach that we do. So be sure to sign up for our listservs and newsletters so you can get reminders about those talks in the spring. Finally, I want to say logistically, we want you to be engaged with our speaker today, so please put questions into the chat box as you think of them, and we'll monitor those throughout the talk, and there'll be an opportunity for questions at the end. Before we begin, I also would like to thank our sponsors who have helped make today's event possible. Our fall speaker series has been sponsored by the Themester 2021, which was focused on resilience. And of course, that's an initiative of the IU College of Arts and Sciences. So thanks to the Themester. At long last, please let me introduce you to today's speaker, Caitlin Alcantara. Caitlin is an anthropological bioarchaeologist in the Department of Anthropology at Indiana University Bloomington. Her work is centered on foodways as tools of empowerment. Melding bioarchaeological dietary isotope analyses and ethnographic interviews, her current research contextualizes food sovereignty movements in late post-classic and contemporary Tlaxcala, Mexico. As a Mexican-American, she is also interested in the ways food is tied to memory, identity, and homeland among Latinx immigrants in the United States, and working with land to develop embodied pedagogies of self-decolonization. We're so excited to have Caitlin here to speak to us today. Caitlin, I'll turn it over to you now.
Thank you so much, and thank you everybody for taking some time out of your lunch hour to come listen. Just give me a second to pull up my talk. All right, does everything look all right? All right, thank you. All right, so my name is Caitlin Alcantara, and today I'll be talking about food as a way of storytelling about the way the world works. We've already done a land acknowledgement, but I do want to just bring into the conversation the idea that wherever we're living, we aren't separate from the land we're on. The air that we breathe, the water, the trees, the animals. This is a picture of some deer in my backyard. These are all legacies of Native caretakers of the space. So how we live every day is incredibly indebted to their work, even as we're taking resources that we're not balancing or replenishing. So I'd like to acknowledge all of this labor and energy and care that's put into this land that we're presenting from. Today, I will be talking first about the idea of food and embodied knowledge, then go into my archaeological work, ethnography work, and then the work that I'm currently doing in Bloomington, as well as inspirations for this work. So at the center of this presentation is the question about how the food we eat tells stories about what worlds are possible. And to think about how we can understand this question, I want to start with this idea of food and embodied knowledge. So I know everybody is around lunchtime, so maybe you'll be even more inspired to think through this, but I'd like to ask everybody to just imagine a meal that you've consumed, something that maybe brings up memories of comfort or connection or something positive. Thinking about this meal, thinking about all the senses that you experience. What does it look like when it's on the plate? Do you imagine, when you think of this meal, all the processes that go into making it, peeling potatoes or chopping up vegetables? Do you think about where the ingredients come from? Do they come from the grocery store? Is it something that you've grown in your own garden? Is it something that you've been gifted vegetables? Who prepared it, and how did they learn how to do it? How is it eaten? So all of these things are things that we inherently know, and that tell us a little bit about how the world works. You know that a meal that you're thinking of might be something that you eat alone, like a microwaved mac and cheese, or it could be something that you really only eat with other people, like a big pot of stew. You know if it's prepared correctly or incorrectly. You can smell, even if you're not a cook yourself, you can smell or taste something that will tell you what is missing or that something isn't quite correct. So through the act of eating, we're learning about how different ingredients come together. We're learning about freshness of ingredients. We're learning about the process of care through food, being given foods that has been taken a long time to make, or that comes with a big story. So through this all, the main idea that I want to get across is this idea that food is this embodied information about how the world works. And this is taught through the act of cooking and eating, not just through recipes or through the ingredients themselves, but through interacting with them. And to give an example of this, I want to talk about the image that was the cover image for this presentation. So this is a cookbook, a recipe book that my great-great-grandfather in Mexico wrote, and that is a part of my family. My father gifted this to me a couple of years ago, and we tried to make one of the recipes out of it. It's coco a la crema, which is supposed to be this coconut pudding. And so we got all the things and we made this coconut pudding together, and it did not turn out at all. And this was something that just made me realize how much the doing of the thing, not just reading about it, not just taking all of the pieces and putting them together, but the act of being around other people and seeing how they engage, how they know things about the ingredients. I assume that maybe the ingredients were a lot different in quality than they were, 100 years ago. So that's maybe why our pudding turned out more as like a chunk of coconut with sugar on it. But these are all things that we learn through. If, for example, my father had learned this recipe directly from my grandfather, maybe he would know some things about the consistency and how we were going along. So this is all to bring us to the idea that currently, as most of us are living in the United States, we're living within this globalized capitalistic worldview. We're living lives that are very rushed. We're living lives that are often very separated from the natural world, often very separated from community. And this is something that is one way among many ways of living in the world. But when you're surrounded by it, it's very difficult to see what other possibilities there are. And it's very easy to normalize this one way of seeing and being in the world, so much so that you can't even see other options that are right in front of you and that are made possible for you. So I turn to archaeology as something that helps remind us of other ways that the world has existed in the past. This is an image of the basin of Mexico in central Mexico, which is the area that I work in. This is currently Mexico City. But this is an image that was painted to show what the Aztec capital of Tenochtitlan would have looked like around 1400. So my work as an archaeologist is centered in central Mexico. This is the work that I did during my dissertation. My dissertation question was looking at this site of Tlaxcala. You can see here in red that it was an area, it has about the same size as a state today, but it was an area that resisted the Aztec Empire even as the empire spread across all of central Mexico into this blue area. And they were neighbors. Mexico City and Tlaxcala are just 2 hours away from each other. I grew up on this landscape with family in Puebla, Mexico, which is right near Tlaxcala. Driving between these two areas, the mountains, the volcanoes are very familiar to me. And, you know, I think this has helped me be able to connect this past and the present because I'm familiar with the way that milpa cornfields got the landscape, the smell of wood smoke in the mountains, all of these kind of sensory experiences for imagining what this landscape would have been like in the past. But essentially during this period, Tlaxcala was able to resist the Aztec Empire. And my question was how and what role did foodways or understanding of the landscape allow them to survive this kind of surrounding by the Aztec Empire and by imperial tributary states that blocked trade and connection to other parts of central Mexico. So here's another image that I really enjoy. This is by a digital artist. And this is an image again of Mexico City, Tenochtitlan. So on the upper picture is what it would have looked like. It was a lake in the basin of Mexico during pre-Hispanic period, and currently has been drained to form the ground for Mexico City. And so it's this image that shows the way that the same ecosystem, the same landscape has been manipulated into completely different ways. One in which the city was built atop this lake. There were floating gardens that were the form of agriculture, and another where the water was completely drained and the land is being used to develop, to industrialize. So through my work, I use dietary isotopes, which are carbon and nitrogen elements that become part of our diet, become part of our bodies through our diet. I was trained in this method as something pretty dry. We have this image here that essentially whatever you eat, when you measure the elements that are left in your body tissues, you can map them onto these kind of categories of food. But these are very defined categories. They're very broad categories, and they don't really match onto what the act of eating actually feels like and what it actually looks like. A lot of times we have things that are going in between. We have things that are mixed. And another part of this traditional dietary isotope map is this idea that a lot of the things that we consider edible as archaeologists coming from North America into other parts of the world are very much defined by our Western understanding of food and relationships to the environment, and don't reflect the way that food was seen in the past prior to industrialization. So one of the things that inspired me to go further than this really dry map of how to map food in the past was this mural that was painted by a muralist, Desiderio Xochitl, in the gubernatorial palace in Tlaxcala City. And this image is based off of, he did this deep dive in all of these Aztec codices, all of these pictorial records of what life looked like just after Spanish arrival in about 1520. And this image is based off of a collection of information, of archaeological information, and shows what a market in Tlaxcala would have looked like prior to Spanish arrival. And what I love about this image is that it shows so much detail about all of the abundant things that were available. And these are things that are still seen, shown, and marketed in this way in Mexican markets. And this stands in direct contrast to the way that our grocery stores work in the United States. And it helped me see a lot of how much of the way that people were seeing food, seeing sharing and selling of food as a commodity, but also food as a way to connect with one another, is still very present in contemporary Mexican culture. So this helped me to think about how to make a dietary isotope map, how to think about food in the past in a way that was more in alignment with the culture that I was looking at, specifically with not just Mexico, but with the social systems of the indigenous groups that lived in Mexico prior to Spanish arrival. So another thing that helped me define and develop this embodied aspect of how these food systems worked was to do oral history, collect oral histories from community members who were very much a part of how all of this knowledge has been maintained as part of the culture in Tlaxcala. So in this section, I go into a couple of interviews that I did with individuals. This is one pair of individuals that I interviewed, Dalia Rodriguez Hernandez and Nicolas Hernandez Munoz. They are a mother and a daughter, and they have one of the last smoke kitchens in Tlaxcala. They grill, they cook everything over these wood stoves and use a lot of traditional methods of cooking, of foraging as well, in part because at the beginning, before they became famous for this, it was out of necessity. Getting food directly from the landscape is something that's free. And they were able to use knowledge about that was passed down to them to be able to go onto a hillside and collect enough nutritious and diverse foods to feed their family in moments where money was really tight. So the first person that I'd like to talk about is a maguey farmer, Jaime Gaspar Garcia. And if you've ever been in Mexico, maguey dots landscape is used often to retain terraces and farms. It is what we get pulque, and some of them are for how we get tequila and other liquors. Maguey has formed a part of Mesoamerican culture for a long time. This is again one of the images from the gubernatorial palace that shows how maguey was used in the past. And this was one of the experiences that I felt like I most began to understand that just seeing these things in images, seeing them in archaeological sites isn't the same as living alongside these ingredients, these plants, these ecosystems. So I spent several visits with Jaime, and I would follow him as he went out at 6 a.m. Into his maguey fields and go through the process of collecting the liquid that pools in the middle to make pulque, which is a fermented drink. And it was, you know, I think some might see it as like an unproductive day. I wasn't interviewing him. I wasn't trying to document everything that he was doing. It was just an accompaniment out in nature and trying to help and not be a burden as well. So as we were out there, this image in the center is what the landscape looks like. So it's a pretty dry landscape. And I think for me, at least, it wasn't something that screamed abundance. It wasn't something that showed, you know, that there were a lot of fruit trees or berries or anything that I would identify as food. But as the day went on, and we were out there, you know, from 6 a.m. and this was probably about 1 p.m. We'd been out there all day. I was hungry. I didn't see food anywhere. And he tells us that it's time for comida. It's time for the midday meal. And he and a few other of the people who were accompanying him just went out and started collecting things from around the landscape. So they went over to a maguey plant and would cut off one of the pencas, one of the leaves, and this became the plate. You could strip the skin off of that same penca and it becomes this aromatic wrap that you can put rabbit in or other things to give it flavor. They used the sticks from trees around to create a fire and pulled out tortillas from a bag and rice and beans and all of these things. But so many aspects of the meal came directly from the landscape. And one of the things that he was telling me about is that this was something that he learned from his parents, grandparents, again, about how abundant the landscape is and how much you can get from it if you are able to see and know where to look. And so out of this, again, was that embodied experience of food. I hadn't had this experience before, and being able to accompany him, I now know what the smell of, the burning embers are, how you have to get them to a certain temperature before you can throw the tortillas on so they don't burn. I now know different materials that you can use to create the fire, to create the plates, to create different components of the meal. Another aspect of this meal was that it was eaten together. As we were sitting there on the side of a field, people would walk down this dirt road and they would just join us. They weren't necessarily people that he knew or maybe didn't know closely, but it was an aspect of the meal that was just, there was so much abundance of food that it made sense to just allow whoever to come by, pour themselves a cup of pulque, serve themselves a plate, and with the idea that it would just, be enough food if we allowed it to be. So in this idea, maguey isn't just a plant. Maguey becomes this kind of center of a way of existing in the world, a way of relating to one another. It's a way of life. While he's a maguey farmer and focuses a lot on this particular plant, it's about how this plant fits into a larger ecosystem and understanding that ecosystem and the way that it can create the possibility for his industry to continue. Another example that I'm turning to is the nopal cactus. And another colleague, Seferino Manuel Tetlamatzi, who is a nopal farmer and agroecological grower. Again, similar experience of just going out and helping him weed his nopal farm. And from this experience, I was able to see how, for me, what looked like a single crop actually turned into so much more options for food, for just living alongside this plant. And so if you've ever seen a nopal before, I did not know that there are actually hundreds of different types of this cactus, and that each one tastes different, is used differently, has different insects that come to it. And so as we were out there, he would show me, slice off a fruit and peel the fruit, and we'd have this sweet, beautiful fruit to eat. He would dig into the nopal paddle and pull out these insects that you can fry up for protein. The fiber of the nopal can later be used for different projects. This is a nopal paddle sliced, and it kind of tastes like watermelon rind. And again, there's different consistencies, different flavors. And the cochinilla insect is an insect that grows on the nopal, and that you can squish the little bodies and they create this dye that's been used for thousands of years to dye cloth, to dye different materials. And again, this just demonstrates this abundance of the landscape if you know how to look for it. And if you have this knowledge that is really only gained and understood through embodied learning, through being out there and actually sitting in the landscape and observing and paying attention to the rhythms of nature, paying attention to the seasons, paying attention to the different insects and animals that are there. And the nopal is one of the elements of the Mexican flag. And I think that it's just really interesting to think about it as this static object that we see in codices and on the flag as a symbol. And then the difference between actually living alongside of it and how much it represents in terms of knowledge about growing, about obtaining food, about socializing, about all of these interconnected networks that go beyond the human to include the natural, the plant, the animal world as well. So within indigenous populations in the Americas, there's this persistent narrative of the dramatic population decline that happened in the early colonial period. So this is an image that, or a graphic that captures the rapid loss of life that happened in those first few years, in part due to disease and epidemics, in part due to violence, in part due to the destruction of a social system and a social and an ecological system as well. So These narratives are persistent in the United States as well, in Canada with First Nations populations. This idea that Indigenous groups in the Americas are lost, or that their knowledge has been ruptured and no longer is accessible. And so one of the questions that I ask in my work is, if all of this is true, then how do we see evidence of this still persisting in Mexico and Mexican foodways? And another interview that I did was with a friend, Felipe Navahuatzi. We met on the archaeological site that I was working at. He is from Tlaxcala. His family has lived there for several generations. And he and his brother are both archaeologists. And in talking to him, I learned about how they became archaeologists because they saw with their grandparents growing things in the landscape, how these artifacts would pop up as they were harvesting things, because the landscape in central Mexico was so densely occupied in this period prior to the arrival of the Spanish, that really your ancestors are everywhere. There are pieces of ceramic that remind you they're there, figurines, all kinds of things. And that kind of reminder, I got to see how this history is replenished through each generation, in part because of his daughter, who followed us around while he was showing me his garden, I was interviewing him. And he has decided to kind of raise his family and follow a tradition that's similar to his grandparents. And he lives in contemporary Tlaxcala, and he's lived in Mexico City, but really values this way of life as something that creates balance for his own mental health and physical health. And so training his daughter also to see and read the landscape in that way, by having her accompany him when he gardens, by having her help him harvest. And he talked about also his grandparents doing similar things as part of his weekly chores, was to go out and help them in the garden. And so this way that intergenerational knowledge, again, is also transmitted through these embodied acts, not necessarily through formal lessons or through school, but through this being in the space in a certain way. And to get back to kind of the archaeological aspect of this, as I was analyzing the outcome of the dietary isotopes, which essentially showed me what different people's diets in the population looked like, some of the patterns that I saw really mimicked what I was hearing in the interviews. Communal foodways, I think, were a big part of how people maintained sovereignty. We see that all of the diets are very closely grouped, whereas in other populations with more hierarchy, you might see people getting access to different things. And so seeing the way that Don Jaime, when he had his outdoor kind of picnic of food, would just invite people to share, this helped me understand why or how this ancient population may have done something similar. We also see the diet mapping onto a lot of the ingredients that I learned from friends were key parts of the landscape, like the nopal, like the insects that are surrounding these plants, like the maguey as well. And so it's giving this life to this archaeological context, that I'm able to better imagine what those lifeways may have been like, stepping outside of a world where I spend most of my time indoors in front of a computer. Most of my learning comes from higher education spaces that are very classroom centric, very reading centric. So from this work, doing archaeology as well, with this population, with these colleagues who've helped me accumulate this knowledge, we started to talk about how archaeology can actually feed into food sovereignty movements in contemporary Tlaxcala. So Mexico, as a specific case study that is pretty common throughout Latin America, had kind of this rupture moment of Spanish arrival, of large loss of life, and then had another moment around the Mexican Revolution, where land was returned to a lot of indigenous groups, but still indigenous groups were not considered kind of part of the central population. And now in the 1990s, with the free trade agreement with NAFTA, again, this idea of land sovereignty, of food sovereignty was brought to the table in terms of how people are allowed to grow, how the land in Mexico is used, and with that, how people are allowed to view the world, how they are allowed to interact with the world, whether it's only through industrialized kind of worldviews or space to maintain these other approaches to growing and sharing food. And so the people that I worked with are all already involved in several food sovereignty movements within Tlaxcala. These grassroots movements are a lot about knowledge sharing, problem solving. If, for example, one particular family has a gap in their lineage of knowledge, they're able to together bring all of these different approaches and share this embodied learning through kind of knowledge shares within the community. What I was able to contribute through archaeology was evidence of the deep time impact of this way of organizing. And so while they were able to give me kind of an example of how this looks like in the present in my own lifetime's embodied experience, I was able to show them, this fight is something that's been happening since before the Spanish arrived. This is a way that Tlaxcala resisted the Aztec Empire. And so what you're doing is valuable and is a valid way of kind of resisting other ways of being in the world. So together we created a documentary that will be screening next year called Comida como Resistencia, Food as Resistance, which shows a lot of these embodied moments that we have together. So keep an eye out for that. So the concluding section of my talk is thinking about how we can reclaim these ways of being through doing wherever we are. As I mentioned, we often don't even realize what we are missing because we get so ingrained in the way that we're engaging in the world and the way that we're engaging in nature. In the United States, a lot of environmental resilience movements are about saving nature, about protecting nature, but aren't necessarily about coexisting with or learning from and recognizing the ways in which it's not just about saving these plants and these animals, but it's actually a benefit to our own health as well, both mental and physical. So in these examples, the main question that I'm looking is, how do we relearn to see these ways of existing in the world? One of the ways that I have been experimenting with, and we are in our first year, so there are still a lot of errors and things that we're learning about, is through the Healing Garden. So this is a project that was started in March at Hilltop Gardens. And here's the website if y'all want to explore kind of some of the things that we've done. But the idea behind the Healing Garden was to gather students, faculty, community members, anybody who wants to come together to be in this space and practice what it looks like to not have the sense of urgency or the sense of I have to do it all alone, or the sense of just not enough time to be outside. So since March, we've been spending Saturdays together in the garden and have some other events that we've held as well. One of the things that I have really noticed through this gathering of people is recognizing our own seasonal rhythms. We're currently in a moment of rest in the garden. We closed out right before Thanksgiving, and as we were nearing this fall period, the garden, all of this abundance that existed in the summer was slowly starting to die off, and there was less and less to do, and also less and less people showing up because we're also burnt out. And so this recognition of how the garden helped us mark our own seasonal rhythms and our own seasonal needs of getting towards this period of darkness and more illnesses, and just needing to take that moment to rest and kind of process what we're doing. Taking inspiration from a lot of the people I worked with in Mexico, this has also been a space where we share skills. So we're not necessarily an intergenerational, or at least the same lineage from the same family sharing information, but we're able to share from our different backgrounds, what kinds of things we know about nature. And we've drawn a lot of students who are coming from many different countries. And so it's been interesting to see how being on Indiana land, seeing what grows here in Indiana has parallels to other places in the ways people are able to make those connections. Another thing that I've really enjoyed about the space is the abundance of it, being able to share everything that we grow every week. There was always ample food to give away, and at some points we were able to donate it as well to food pantries. But this idea that there isn't enough food in the world, this garden, I think, really shows how easy it is to cultivate this sense of abundance, of sharing, of a single tomato producing hundreds of other tomato plants, and how many extra things you get just by planting those seeds and tending that plant. And the sense of abundance, not just in terms of food, but in terms of social networks. So this garden was started during the pandemic, and this was a period of a lot of depression, a lot of anxiety, a lot of stress, a lot of fear of not having enough energy, not having enough time to do all the things. And so this space was really also created to bring people together, and not necessarily be a space for work. Our ideology wasn't to grow a certain number of things and sell this food or give it away and have these expectations of us from the garden, but it was rather to just show up and dedicate this time to yourself, to be able to check in with your body, see what you need, know that you have this social network here as well that you can tap into, we would play music and do activities together, but it was also absolutely acceptable to show up and just sit there, or show up for 30 minutes and then decide that you didn't have social energy. So creating this space for just knowing that whatever you need, we were able to cultivate that in the space. So I want to conclude by inviting you all to check out these resources. We are trying to open up the Healing Garden space to more classes coming through. We created a learning curriculum that you can download from the website or request print versions. And we're also scheduling classes to come visit in the spring semester. There's things to do in the garden year round, so feel free to incorporate us into your syllabi. A lot of the discussions that we have are about decolonizing knowledge, decolonizing the land, recognizing how much we know just by what our bodies recognize in the world, and also having conversations about why we've gotten so separated from the land and what kind of impacts this can have on communities that have been forcibly displaced, communities that have had these ruptures, their connections to place. Another project that we're working on is the Restorative Foodways project. This is through the Indiana Studies program, and it's dedicated to creating space for people to connect to memories and identity through food and recipes. And so we're creating a community book cookbook. One way you can get involved is by signing up to share a recipe that you'd like to share. And another way is by participating in future community meals. We held one meal in October, and it was very successful. We had about 30 people show up and created these recipes that you can see kind of in the background, sharing stories and just using this connection storytelling as a way to witness all of these different experiences that are held in Bloomington. I want to acknowledge some other projects that have inspired me and that I have enjoyed being in conversation with. So if you have the opportunity, please check these out. And then these are some of the books that are currently in my mind influencing the way that I am thinking through these questions. So I think that is all I have to share with you right now, and I'd be happy to open up for any questions that we have. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Caitlin. That was fantastic. So interesting, the work that you're doing, your research, as well as this wonderful programming you're doing now here at IU at Hilltop. I want to start there with a question about the Healing Garden, if you don't mind. I'm curious if it is just a program, or if it is there a plan for research that involves the folks in the land involved in that program?
Yeah, I think right now I'm giving it space to be an exploratory project that is really looking for what people want to make out of it. I think for me, it was important to involve it in my pedagogy of my classes, get out of the classroom and into the garden as much as possible, just because of the amount of stress that I was seeing in myself and in students, and having that be a way to learn. The classes that I was teaching at the time were about prehistoric diet and nutrition and food in the body. So how this food system, these issues we see in the food system, how we can learn about alternative ways, physically being in the space and planting and learning how these plants grow, watching them through their different stages. So that was the original kind of project. But as we've developed a team, I'm seeing graduate students themselves coming up with independent projects about pedagogy and how it influences childhood development, or about sounds in nature and how those influence emotions and feelings. I think for my own research, one of the things that I'm really interested in is exploring, again, this embodied learning as something that can impact mental health and that can impact well-being in communities, and also validate a lot of the ways of learning and being in the world that we discredit in the academy, or that we minimize in the academy by only accepting written work as valid knowledge. And so making space for students to consider those other ways of knowing as well.
I applaud you for that. And I realize the irony of my question asking you whether or not you're going to do your work in the garden, where you're trying to avoid that for mental health and wellness. But thanks for entertaining it though. And I'm glad that students are seeing opportunities for potential research as well as rest there. That's good. I'm curious about what you can say about contemporary circumstances in the area that you worked in, Mexico, with climate change, development, industrialization of agriculture. I can just imagine that the landscape is really being challenged to continue to be abundant in these ways that you've talked about. And I wonder if that's true. First of all, if you could talk about some of the biggest challenges, either social, economic, or biophysical, and then specific efforts to address those beyond the networking, the intergenerational networking, the indigenous knowledge sharing that you've talked about. Does any of this start to move towards policy or structures that will actually facilitate that beyond being kind of grassroots efforts?
Yeah, so these are projects that were already started, but that I'd like to kind of tap into as well and put my part into. But one of the things that has been really effective has been policy change that was started by the traditional cooks. And what they were arguing was the need to protect certain ingredients because they're part of the national patrimony of certain foods. And so they were able to create, kind of going in the back door through food, which, the nation is very proud of its food and of these foodways. And so protecting that was an easier way to get at these questions of development than coming from the front and saying, we want to protect land, because I think land is something that within capitalism is very easily bought and sold and isn't seen as something that's really valuable. But tying it to this cultural aspect of food was one way that they were able to do that. And I think that my work, one way that I'd like to take it in the future, is to show how these areas that are seen as kind of wild and maybe not cultivated in terms of like the grassland area that I showed you, are actually areas of high biodiversity and have really highly nutritious plants that are growing there because of that biodiversity. And so even though they're not agriculturally plentiful, a lot of this historical tie to these food, to these ingredients that are able to be harvested and collected from there, are also tied to these solutions to malnutrition and to issues in the diet in populations that are dealing with poverty but have a solution. And rather than trying to get them to other food networks outside of what they've already developed, recognizing that they know and they have a solution, it's all about not undermining that solution. And I'm trying to think like what other projects. So from the agroecological market that I work with there, they have a few different organizations that travel globally and meet with other Indigenous organizations around the world that are also facing the same thing. I think that this idea of embodied knowledge isn't just minimized in academia, it's minimized globally and is seen as something that's not really very valuable. And so trying to figure out how to change that language so that it's legible to corporations, to places that view the world in such a different way that they can't even understand that that is, another form of knowledge.
Yeah, excellent. Dan asks, there are several theories that tie together codified or book knowledge with tacit or embodied knowledge. Which of those rings most true to your work? Or can you comment on that?
Sure. I'm not entirely sure I understand the question, but I'll try and answer it in the way that I do understand it. So I understand it in that there's book knowledge and embodied knowledge, and you're asking me which one I think is more valid or appropriate. Is that?
I think there are theories that tie them together.
Okay.
Is how he frames it. And so what theories are you aware of that ring true in your work that bring these together?
Yeah, well, the books that I shared in the suggestions, I think one that I've read recently, Decolonizing the Diet, is taken from a bioanthropology perspective, kind of a nutritionist perspective that shows how from like a biogeochemical view, a lot of these food systems weren't just about traditions or about, Native American community activities, but that those community activities were deeply tied to ecosystems of health. And so as those ecosystems were destroyed, you see the loss of stories, this knowledge in ways that is written down, but you'll also see this loss of knowledge in terms of the way that you're able to live on the landscape as well. And I think that they make a really good point in that we need both of those things working together, that you can't just have one or the other. These systems of knowledge need to be multifaceted in order to capture all of the different types of information that we get from the world. I'm not sure if that answered, but that's what I've got.
Dan, if you want to follow up with that, I welcome that. In the meantime, a student asks, made the comment that food culture, you've made him aware that food culture really could be connected to something as large as the kinds of societies that we have, right? A communal society, which you see reflected in that sitting by the side of the road invitation to folks, that you don't even know, and that's connected to communal society versus perhaps a hierarchical society. And the student asked if you could talk a little bit more about that literature, the connections that we know are there between food culture and sort of, I guess, societal norms.
Yeah, I mean, I see this a lot as somebody who was raised in Mexico and the United States. And when I go back to Mexico, I make so many mistakes because I'm used to living in the US way, which, like, if you think about, at least my experience of, like, you go over to somebody's house and they've made the food for you and you come over for dinner and, you have dinner with them and you say thank you and you chat and maybe they make coffee. And, in Mexico, in my family, you show up and you help finish everything. You help make the food because that's part of it. You're having conversation, you're learning, they're giving you the experience of learning how to make this food as well. And then when it's done, you help wash dishes as well. And you're part of the whole integral experience. And I think one of the things that I've been thinking about a lot in higher education, especially again about this crisis during COVID of people just really struggling, is how for a lot of students that are coming from backgrounds that are really centered around that community care into the space that is very much about individual success and individual responsibility and reliance. I think a lot of the literature that's been written on like first generation students and kind of the inherent hierarchy in higher education can be translated into this idea of food as an example of this learning, and how a lot of the skills that have helped our communities survive by sharing, by collectively working on things get stripped in this space, and that has so many impacts to health and mental health and capacity to make it through the system. So I think that those could be interesting literature worlds to link.
Another student that's on is interested to learn more about your personal experiences that led you to your research and how it's grounded in food and culture around food. You know, you told us this really great story about your grandfather's cookbook and the recipe that you attempted, and but are there other experiences that have led you to where you are in your research?
Yeah, I think so. I was born in Mexico City and then came to the States when I was about 5. And my parents divorced. My dad stayed in Mexico. My mom and I were in the States. And I would go back to Mexico every summer. And I think being able to see those two different worldviews from a really young age and compare them and kind of have to adapt to those two different worlds made me really aware that there are different ways that we live in the world, and they shape the way we interact with one another. They shape the way that we interact with the things that are around us, with the nature that is around us, with the way we think about what is real and what's not real, what is important, what's not important. And I think my work comes out of struggling to match those two, making mistakes when I'm in the States, making mistakes when I'm in Mexico, trying to figure out what truth is true for me. And for me, I think food has been this kind of, rather than food, plants have been this way that connects me, because plants grow really similarly everywhere. You put them in the ground and they grow. And they're kind of independent of our human culture. We interact with them and then we shape them into agriculture. But even if you just throw some seeds on the ground, they're going to grow. And so it's been this way to like find a common ground between cultures, and then from those roots of the metaphorical plants, see how they start to shift and be shaped by different people in different ways, and what those ways tell us about people's values. And I think, yeah, like learning how food really marks me in the US as Mexican because of the way that I cook and what I cook and what I have in my kitchen. I've got some big old jars of dried peppers and, have a bunch of tortillas in the fridge, and how we can connect ourselves to different places through food, and connect ourselves to different moments and different ways of being through food, no matter where we are. And yeah, I think those have been some really big factors in defining my work.
I'm curious about how if you've been able to travel through the pandemic and continue your research, asking because I'm curious about how isolation in a culture that is so communal would have impacted some of the I guess methods of their sustainability and persistence of indigenous knowledge retention and use to sustain the landscape and the people. Do you see, have you heard about that, or have you actually studied it? Have you been?
Yeah. So actually, we did a activity together where last January we did an Instagram cooking series. So working with the people that you saw in this presentation, I did an episode with each one where we met on Instagram, them in their kitchens in Mexico, me in my kitchen in the US, and we kind of cooked together. And it was really interesting to kind of play in that way about across space and time. So that was one activity and way that I was able to maintain kind of my research, and also to try and introduce people in the States to this, even though it's virtual embodiment, it's still kind of like embodied in a different place. And then I was able to go back to Mexico last winter break and spend time there. And I think people both really ignored the social distancing because of kind of weighing the value of depression, social isolation, economic isolation, and how expensive it is to just feed yourself versus making a big bunch of food and sharing it. But one of the interesting things, and when I was recording for the documentary, this was other material that maybe I'll use in a different time, was talking to people about their experience of the pandemic and of COVID, and how people saw their connection to the landscape, being able to be outside, being able to live a lot of their life outdoor in this outdoor space versus like in apartment buildings, being able to access all of these foods when the food systems were collapsing, and grow their own foods. That the pattern was that they were actually very resilient through illnesses. A couple people did get sick, others did not, but particularly the Maguey farmer, he and his wife got really sick, and they're older, they're probably in their late 60s, and had their doctor tell them, I think it's your way of life is what saved you. The fact that you have access to all these like high nutrient foods, and that you are active and happy in your life, like these are things that helped you make it through this, where I've seen so many people not. And I think that's another kind of component of the healing garden, is helping people realize like how these networks of care aren't just about like, are you happy? Are you having fun? But they can keep people from, extreme mental distress. They can keep people from getting sick by reducing your stress load in your body so that your immune system has enough energy. So I think all of these things are really linked, and it's definitely something that I really want to explore further. I'm hoping to be able to go back for a period this summer and follow up with people.
Thank you. That was excellent. What a good note to end on, to think about all of the co-benefits that come from the experience of being, coexisting with nature and one's culture through food and through plants. Thank you so much, Caitlin, for your insightful work. Very thought-provoking, and we appreciate your time and energy today. Thanks everybody for attending, and we will see you next semester at the next Resilient Speaker Series. Thanks again, Caitlin.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.